Mark Twain said a classic is something that everyone wants to have read and nobody wants to read. I wonder how he would feel about the fact that his books are now considered classics. If you're looking to read more classics, but just can't seem to find that motivation, in this video I want to share some tips with you for how to make the process a little bit easier and even a little bit more fun. What's up everybody, I'm Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and today's video I'm going to share with you some tips for how to get more enjoyment out of reading the classics so that it doesn't feel like a chore and you actually enjoy reading these gems of books which we can all benefit from. And if you stick around till the end of the video, then you'll also get a little bonus gift from me, which don't worry, I'm not trying to sell you anything. This is completely free, just something from me to you that maybe might help you in your path to reading a few more classics. So I'm going to break this down into sort of 3 general categories of tips, and then within each category I'll give a couple of different examples, starting with the first category, which is to find a way to make reading the classics fun or to turn it into a game. The first way that I would suggest turning reading the classics into a little bit of a game is to create for yourself sort of a little challenge, a personal challenge of how many of these classics you're going to read, in what order, in what time frame. I, for myself, have created for myself what I like to call my bucket list. In case you didn't get that, that is my bucket list of books to read before well, you know what a bucket list is. So bad pun aside, the bucket list, or my sort of books that I must read before I die, this is just a list that I've put together, and the way that I've done this is maybe a little bit different. So the way that I created this list was I started by going online and finding as many of the greatest book of all time lists that I could get my hands on. And so I think I used about 5 or 6 different greatest books of all times lists, most of which had over 100 books on them. And what I did was I took all of these different lists, I threw them all into a spreadsheet, and then I went through sort of this giant database of books that were on all these different lists, and I started paring it down to those books that I personally wanted to make sure that I read before in addition to that, I added a little bit of a twist on this because in addition to just sort of listing out the books that I wanted to read, I also decided that I was going to turn this into a little game for myself, and I was going to read these books in chronological order of publication. The idea being that by sort of reading these books from the earliest one ever published all the way to the latest one published, I would kind of get to see how literature has evolved and how sort of the earlier books influenced the later books, and so on and so forth. All of which, again, not particularly meaningful, but it makes it into a fun little game that turns it into something that I use to motivate myself to go through this list of absolutely great books. Okay, so that is the first example of how you can make the pursuit of reading more classics just a little bit more fun, and that is by creating sort of your own version of the bucket list. The second example I can give of turning this into a little bit of a game is something that I actually stole from Benjamin McAvoy from Hardcore Literature. If you've never checked out his channel, definitely give it a view. I love the stuff that Benjamin puts out because he really sort of approaches the classics in sort of a very accessible way, not pretentious at all, but really gets deep into it, and he does it in sort of this way that comes off both intelligent and approachable, which I really admire. Anyway, that aside, so the way that what I'm actually getting to here is this idea of living the classics. And what do I mean by living the classics? Well, what I don't mean is I don't mean that you need to necessarily dress up as a Victorian gentleman or lady while you're reading Dickens. If you want to, you can, by all means, but that's not the goal, right? The idea of living the classics is that you would sort of take a book and sort of read it as if you were a reader when it was first published. So Dickens novels were published serially, which means that they were published one part at a time, right? So it was essentially sort of one chapter would be published 1 month, and then you'd have to wait a month for the next chapter to come out, and sort of so on and so forth, right? And so the idea behind living the novel would be to put yourself in the place of the original reader of this work and sort of try and follow that same schedule. So when you read Great Expectations, for example, find the publication schedule for Great Expectations and read the book as if only a certain part of it was coming out over a certain period of time. What this means is you end up having to read the book over a much longer period of time, so you're not going to finish Great Expectations in a weekend. But what it allows you to do is kind of draw out that experience and really sort of live with the novel. Think about it. Allow yourself to build an anticipation for the next piece of it, right? And so this idea of living the novel really gives you this sense of engaging with it more deeply and more fully. The other way you can do this is if you have a specific author that you really enjoy and you want to kind of go through their entire catalog of works. You could read their catalog of works in sort of the order in which they were published. And if you really want to take this to the extreme, you can even sort of create the gaps in between publication that were in real life. So if you have an author, for example, who published their first book in year X and they published their second book 7 years later, you could, in theory, read their first book, wait 7 years, and then read their second book. The idea there being like you would transport yourself back in time to when fans of this author first engaged with their work and sort of absorb their work in the same order in which they did it, right? So those are just kind of two examples of how you can kind of live an experience and live a book. And there are also ways that you can just have a little bit more fun with the classics. The second way that you can motivate yourself to read the classics a little bit is related in some ways to the first, but different enough that I will call it a separate tip altogether, and that is to go deep. Go deep on the book or on the period or on the author that you're about to read, and I'll explain to you what I mean by going deep in just a second, right? But there are different ways to read a book. You can either pick up a book and just read it cover to cover at a very surface level. And for a lot of books that we read, especially those that we read for pure enjoyment, this is a perfectly fine way to read. With the classics, many times classics you want to read in a little bit more depth. You want to get into a little bit more nuance, right? And so when you read the classics, I would strongly encourage you to annotate them. For those of you who have a strong aversion to marking up books or writing in books or writing in the margins, that's okay. You can still annotate a book without necessarily defacing it. It just means that you have to have either a piece of paper or a notebook on the side where you're going to be taking notes or potentially even journaling alongside reading this. Now, if this seems like homework to you, it's because you are probably thinking back to the assignments that you were assigned back in high school English class, but that's not what I'm talking about here, right? When you annotate a book, especially one that you are reading for your own personal enjoyment and for your own sort of personal development and growth, especially as we are with the classics, because there's no one standing over you forcing you to read these books. You're doing this because you want to, right? And so when you annotate these things, the reason you're annotating is not because someone's going to come back and test you on this later. The reason you're annotating is so that you can engage more fully with the text. And that means that you don't necessarily need to highlight something because you need to retain it. You want to highlight stuff because it's stuff that you are reacting to. It could be a passage in a book that you will that resonates with you, something that made you go, aha, or something that kind of made you feel a certain way. If you had an emotional reaction to something, if you felt yourself choking up at a certain passage, that's something you might want to highlight. If there's a particularly beautiful turn of phrase, put an asterisk on that. If there's sort of these patterns and themes that you see repeating themselves, you can kind of call those out. If you have a suspicion of what's going to happen later on in the book, mark a note of that. Some of the things that I do when I'm marking up books is as simple as, when I see a character doing something that just really annoys me, I will just write like a WTF in the margin or a why question mark, right? I'm just engaging with the book. I'm having a conversation with the book. And you might think to yourself, well, what's the point of doing that? I'm just talking to myself. Well, yes, you are in a way, but you're also talking to the author, right? What you're essentially doing is you're having a conversation with the author, and you're also having a conversation with future you. Because one of the other things I would strongly encourage you to do when you're reading the classics is to come back to them later and reread them. And one of the beautiful things about annotating a book and keeping the notes in the book itself, if you don't want to do that, that's okay. But if you are going to do that, one of the beautiful things about doing that is when you come back to this book, year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years later, and you reread this book, you get to see how past you reacted to the book at the time, and you get to see whether or not current you has the same reactions. There's a really good chance that you will not agree with some of the comments that you made 10, 20 years ago because you have changed as a person, and that's completely okay. But that is one of the really cool things about reading literature is that not only are you engaging with a text that was written by someone potentially hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, but you're also engaging with a past version of yourself. And how often do you get to talk to a past version of yourself, which is just a really cool way of doing this, right? The other example I can give you of going deep, I'm going to use a non-literary example here. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to talk about Star Wars, all right? So growing up, I was a big Star Wars fan. I'm talking about the original Star Wars trilogy. Over time, the Star Wars franchise has ballooned, has exploded. We got the prequel trilogies, we got the sequel trilogy, we've got a million books that have been written in the Star Wars universe. Star Wars was purchased by Disney. There's a ton of Star Wars content out there. And just as many Star Wars fans, at some point I got a little bit disillusioned with where the franchise was going, and I kind of got disconnected. During the pandemic, where we didn't have too much else to do, I kind of found some content or some elements in the Star Wars universe that started to resonate with me a little bit, and I decided that I wanted to kind of get back into that world, even though there were certain things that I knew I wasn't going to be thrilled with. But I wanted to find a way to make it fun for myself because I knew there was enough in there that overall I would enjoy it. And what I found as a way to kind of keep myself engaged was not only did I watch all of the Star Wars movies and all the Star Wars TV shows and read some of the books, but one of the things that I really enjoyed doing, more so in many cases than the actual movies or TV shows themselves, was going online and finding people who would really dive deep and dissect these things, and doing it in such a way that they would bring a greater level of meaning and depth to Star Wars stories that you would not think are there. One specific channel that I can suggest for anyone who's into this kind of nerdy stuff is the Screen Crush channel, specifically Ryan Arey's videos about anything Star Wars and even anything Marvel related are things that I really enjoy watching. Like I said, in many cases more so than I actually enjoyed watching the content itself. Again, because it allows me to engage with the content in a much deeper way. What does this have to do with reading the classics? Well, you can take the very same approach when you're reading classics. Classics can sometimes be a little bit dry, especially for our modern sensibilities, where we have certain expectations that things are going to move at a certain speed, right? So what you can do is, as you're reading these classics, find people who are talking about it, find people who are finding these connections, and sort of engage with that content as well. There's a ton of it on YouTube. There's a ton of great communities on Reddit. So find people that are talking about this stuff and supplement your reading with other people who are doing this on a deeper level, and it'll bring your enjoyment of the material to just that higher level. And the third category or third tip I have for you on how to motivate yourself to read more of the classics is to make it social. Reading is by and large a solitary activity, but there are ways to engage with other people to make it that much more fun, because if you have other people along for the ride with you, it just makes it that much more enjoyable, right? And so there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. You know, you could do actual old school book clubs, which, you know, are fantastic if you can find them, especially if you can find people who have similar tastes in books to you. You can turn it into sort of a weekly event, something that, you know, I think a lot of book lovers wish they had access to, maybe not as popular in this day and age as they once were. But if you can do that, fantastic, do that. If that's not an option for you, then you still have other alternatives, right? Do an online book club. Find some people online who have similar interests to you. Social media is great for that. Find a Reddit group, find a Discord channel, find people who are reading the same stuff as you and sort of read along with a group of people. Find YouTube channels that are reading the same stuff as you and follow along with their reading schedule. Or find one other person and buddy read things together. Even if it's just a single person and it's not a big social circle, having one other person that you're reading with can both make it more fun and can be a little bit motivating, right? Because you're holding each other accountable for getting this stuff done. The other thing that I will say here as sort of a bonus tip is, remember, if you're reading the classics and you are forcing yourself and you're not having fun and it feels like a chore, stop, pause, put it aside, come back to it later. You're not in school anymore. There's no one standing over you forcing you to read this stuff. There's no test at the end of the term. You don't have to do this, right? You're doing this for yourself. If you're not having fun doing it, stop. Just take a break, take a breath, come back to it later. Find what is going to make it fun for you. Don't force it. If you're going to force it, you're just going to end up resenting it, and you're never going to want to pick up one of these books ever again. So make sure you're having fun, and if you're not, come back to it later. Now, lastly, before we go, I did promise you that I would have a little surprise for you, And I don't know how big of a surprise this is, but what I did want to share with you guys is down in the description below, I've linked out to my, what I call my bucket list, or my list of books that I want to read before I kick it. And so if that is something that is interesting to you, if you have always wanted to create a list of books to read for yourself, but you've never felt the desire to actually go out and build your own list, and you kind of just want to steal someone else's list, or if you want to start from my list and change it for your own benefits, or if you just kind of want to look at my list and make fun of me, whatever the case might be, I have linked down to my list below. And so that is a Google Sheet, which I'll give you guys access to. You can take a look at it. Like I said, use it for whatever purpose you see fit. And if I read things or my taste in books is similar to yours in any way, shape, or form, maybe you can just take it wholesale. But I do highly encourage you guys to build out your own list, find what works for you, find the pace that works for you. And yeah, so there's my list, my gift to you guys. Enjoy it. And until next time, I would love to hear what strategies you have for motivating yourself to read the classics. Is motivating the classics even an issue for you? Maybe you have pure drive of your own and you don't need strategies for motivating yourself because it just comes naturally. Let me know. Let's chat about it down in the comments below. And until next time, have fun reading. Cheers, gang.